Vestige of Power by Sara Blackard. Chapter 1. April 7, 1852. Middle of the Rocky Mountains. Joseph Thomas looked out across the swollen creek behind his trapping cabin at the purple jagged mountains that jutted up above the aspen trees, still naked from winter's long hold. He loved the Rocky Mountains he called home. Though many ventured further north, his home deep in the mountains just south of the Oregon Trail suited him. He breathed the crisp early morning air, letting out a contented sigh, though something unknown caused him a sense of unease that stirred within his spirit. The sun prepared to mount its daily ride across the vast blue sky, soaring Joseph's anticipation to new heights. Joseph believed himself a man up to beaver, able to hold his own in any situation. Born 31 years before and raised within these rocky slopes, not much caused him concern. Even when a grizzly attacked him when he was 23 years old, Joseph had remained calm. When the burly thing became bent on eating him, he killed it with his hunting knife, stitched his own chest up where the grizz got a good swipe in, and roasted the best bear steak he'd ever eaten over the open fire. When the Crow warriors captured him while Joseph explored the northern mountains the year his feet got itchy at 25, he'd used his good looks to get one of the young maidens to cut his ties. Joseph ran for days through 3 feet of snow over the mountain passes and miry fields of early summer mud. When he'd finally made it home and friends asked where he'd been traveling to the last 8 months, he'd shrugged it off as wandering around. So the fact that some unknown anxiety had him acting like his drawers swam in fleas made him wonder what God had in store for him. Joseph adjusted the haversack slung across his chest, heavy with his latest haul of gold from his mine he'd stumbled upon a few seasons ago. God had blessed him when he'd led him to take shelter in that hidden cave from the loco windstorm that had ripped through the forest, uprooting trees and hurling hail. After Joseph had lit a fire to dry off, he'd noticed something glittering at him from the cave walls. He never put much stock in chasing fleeting dreams of gold and riches, but that cave made him the richest man west of the Mississippi in an instant, though no one knew it but him and God. No use flaunting news like that around. There remained enough gold in that cave that he'd be digging for years if he wanted to. For now he took it out 1 bag at a time every now and then, so no one would catch wind. Joseph walked along the bank of the creek, contemplating catching a trout or two for breakfast. The sweet song of a warbler flitting across the trees reminded him that summer approached fast. Then the bank gave way, tossing his stomach into his throat as he fell into the raging creek. Suddenly, the heavy blessing of gold became the weight of death. Joseph slammed into hard ground with a grunt and a crash. He pushed onto his elbow expecting water to pour from his buckskin clothes, but instead the smell of refuse assaulted his nose, and clattering discordance of rushing carriages, shouting people, and factories bruised his ears. Quick footsteps approached, so he shook his head to clear out the cobwebs and pushed to his knees. He still gripped his rifle in his right hand, the weight of the gold still clung to his side, but he had somehow landed in a bustling city rather than the roaring creek. Oh my gracious Lord in heaven! A short, stout, elderly man wearing a clergy collar and tidy black clothes rushed down the alley towards Joseph. "My son, are you all right?" The pastor's eyes widened as he glanced up and down Joseph. Joseph peered at the end of the alley and saw people walking to and fro in their fancy suits and fluffy dresses. Joseph supposed he struck an exotic and powerful figure in his buckskin pants and coat that over time became sculpted to his muscled body, his long red hair pulled back into a leather thong, and his beard long and scruffy. Joseph stood the rest of the way, swaying a bit in confusion. He looked at the tall stone buildings squeezed on either side of him, and the blood drained from his face. The old man hurried to his side, placing an arm around his back and holding Joseph up so he didn't tumble back into the refuse. "I believe I am," Joseph faltered as he watched wagons and carriages rushing by the end of the alley. "You could use a bracing cup of coffee if you ask me. I'm Pastor Timothy Hudson, at your service. Why don't you come across the street with me to my church, and we can get you rejuvenated and chat about what's ailing you?" The diminutive man's words rushed out as he grunted with Joseph's weight. "That sounds mighty fine, thank you," Joseph answered, glad for the kindness and opportunity to gather his bearings. "I'm Joseph Thomas." Joseph allowed Pastor Hudson to usher him across the bustling street and into the church nestled in the noise and filth. He figured a church was better than most places to work out what had happened to him. Plus, if he couldn't escape this old man if he had to pull foot and run away, he probably didn't deserve to. As they approached the door, a tall man dressed in finery and built like an ox stopped beside them. "You all right, Pastor Hudson? Do you need help getting rid of this man?" the man asked, spearing Joseph with a look of disgust as he scanned him from head to toe. Joseph glanced down at himself and realized his buckskin pants and coat with their missing fringe and well-used wear didn't fit in with his surroundings any more than he did. No, Mr. Miller. My friend Mr. Thomas just needs a bracing cup of coffee to set him to rights," Pastor Hudson replied, giving Mr. Miller a pointed look. "Well, in that case, have a good day," Mr. Miller replied as he nodded his head and continued down the street. Once Mr. Miller walked out of hearing, Pastor Hudson explained, "Now normally I'm not one to shoo someone off so rudely, Mr. Thomas, but some of my parishioners can be overprotective of me. I guess in my old age, they've forgotten I lived as a missionary to the tribes in northern Mexico. A little adventure now and then isn't going to kill me." Joseph smirked at the pastor's gumption, hoping the man's sense of adventure would extend to Joseph's predicament. Pastor Hudson walked through the door, motioning Joseph to follow. As Joseph wiped his feet, he read the sign that stated First English Evangelical Lutheran Church, affixed to the side of the door. He looked around one more time, noting the street signs 7th Avenue and Montour Way. He recognized none of it. Pastor Hudson pulled the door closed behind Joseph, dulling the cacophony that threatened to drive him crazy. How anyone lived with such racket baffled him. As Pastor Hudson led Joseph into a small office, he looked around at the impressive church. He'd only ever worshipped in his home with his parents before they passed, or around a campfire with other mountain men. Now and then a man of God would travel through, and Joseph would pick his brain with all the questions his daily readings collected, often to the amusement and bewilderment of the recipient. Sit, Pastor Hudson shooed Joseph into a cushioned chair while he pulled a cord next to the door. "Now what brings you to my neighborhood?" Joseph placed his haversack on the floor by his feet and propped his rifle against the wall behind him but within reach. He brushed his pants off before sitting down on the soft cushion. "This is going to sound loco," Joseph started, wondering if he'd have to make a run for it before they had him thrown in an asylum, but it's the truth, not a bit fabricated. Pastor Hudson nodded in encouragement. "Well," Joseph continued, running his hand through his hair with a nervous jerk, "just a few minutes ago, right before you found me, I was walking along a creek in the Rocky Mountains when the bank gave out from underneath me. Instead of drowning in the raging snowmelt waters, I landed in that alley across the way." Joseph stared into Pastor Hudson's dark brown eyes as they got rounder and rounder. The door opened, followed by an older woman wearing a crisp white apron. She gasped when she spied Joseph, running her eyes up and down his unkempt form before turning to the pastor with eyebrows raised in question. "Martha," Pastor Hudson said, not taking his eyes off Joseph, "we will need the strongest coffee you make, please." "Yes, Pastor," she said before rushing away, the door closing with a sharp slam. Pastor Hudson leaned forward, bracing his arms upon his desk and staring at Joseph. "Are you telling me 30 minutes ago you walked in the far reaches of the West, and you suddenly appeared in Pittsburgh on the other side of the continent?" "Pittsburgh, huh?" Joseph repeated, glad to have a part of the puzzle answered. "Never traveled east of the Mississippi before now. Reckon that's the quickest way to travel, though not the best on my nerves. I don't understand how it happened, but I promise you it did. One second I fell, most likely to my demise, the next the dregs of a city surrounded me." "I wonder," Pastor Hudson pondered with a murmur, a knock at the door and Martha pushing a cart in interrupting him. As she poured coffee for Joseph and the pastor and served cookies on delicate china plates, Joseph watched Pastor Hudson as he rubbed his chin deep in thought. Joseph's heart pounded worse than the time he'd gotten caught in the middle of a stampeding herd of bison. He scolded himself on his loss of control as he wiped his sweaty hands on his pants. Of course, this landed far outside of situations he'd ever experienced or even heard of. He wanted to push Sweet Martha out of the room on her cart so he could listen to what Pastor Hudson mulled over in his head. When she'd finally left and the door closed, Pastor Hudson looked Joseph straight in the eyes. "Have you ever read the story of Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in the Bible?" "That's the story that teaches about following God's leading and the importance of baptism," Joseph said, remembering the gist of the story, but not the details. "Doesn't Philip meet the Ethiopian after God told him to walk down the road to nowhere?" Yes, that's the story, and you're right about following God's leading and baptism and all, but you're missing the part that might pertain to your situation," Pastor Hudson said, as he pulled the large Bible from the corner of his desk over and started thumbing through it, mumbling as he read. Here it is. Verse 39 of Acts chapter 8 reads, "And when they were coming up out of the water, the Spirit of the Lord caught away Philip, that the eunuch saw him no more, and he went on his way rejoicing. But Philip was found at Azotus." He peered at Joseph over his glasses. "That's around 20 miles away. So what you're saying is that God moved me here, like he moved Philip?" Joseph watched the pastor's face shine in joyous amazement. "Exactly," Pastor Hudson declared, sitting back in his chair and taking a deep drink of his coffee. "Unless you're inebriated, then the coffee will help sober you up." "I'm not drunk. Never have been, never will be. And what I told you is the truth. Why would God bring me all the way back here?" "It's thousands of miles from my mountains to here," Joseph exclaimed. "Now, son," the pastor tsked, shaking his head, "do you honestly think a few thousand miles matter to the Creator of all time and space? Distance is relative to him. If he could move Philip 20 miles, he can move you around the entire world if he wanted to. Your job now is to figure out why he moved you here, because I can assure you, he doesn't do miraculous feats for his own amusement." "How can you be so sure?" "Well, when I was a missionary in Mexico, the villagers told stories of La Dama Azul, or the Woman in Blue. When I asked around to find out who they were talking about, the villagers explained that she was a nun in Spain that would appear to the people of the area I was in. She prepared the people there for the missionaries that would soon be arriving. At first, I didn't believe it. How could a nun who lived in Spain possibly appear halfway around the world? But when I talked to the priests in the area, they verified that it had happened, and in fact, showed me other instances in their church history where other saints had been taken to different locations through miraculous venues. Then that got me to thinking. If there were records of miracles like Philip's occurring throughout history, did other accounts of miracles exist? I started researching through missionary accounts and church history, and the more I searched, the more I found. So yes, Mr. Thomas, I can be sure, and I am beyond thrilled that God has allowed me to be a part of it. Hebrews chapter 13 verse 8 says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, and today, and forever. Joseph grabbed the delicate china cup and downed the scorching strong coffee in one gulp. The idea God would have something important for him to do awed him. Sure, he'd always followed God's teachings as best he could, and tried to be a light to those he came across in his wanderings, but to be used to this extent? He never fathomed it possible. Shoot, until an hour ago, he didn't imagine miracles of biblical proportions happened anymore. The more he thought about it, the more at peace he became, and his thoughts locked into place. He looked across at the wise man sitting behind the desk and said, "First, I'd like you to pray for me if you don't mind, then I'll need you to direct me to the best bank in town. If I'm here for a purpose, I better lighten the load." After a robust prayer, directions to the Pittsburgh Trust and Savings Company, a quick 6-minute walk away, and a promise to fill Pastor Hudson in on the adventure when he returned for his rifle, Joseph walked onto the busy street, but not before he deposited a large nugget in the offering box. Chapter 2. Joseph walked into the Pittsburgh Trust and Savings Company 10 minutes later. He'd taken the walk there a little more leisurely than normal, cataloging what he saw as he strolled. The men of the upper class dressed in fancy suits made of bright colors and patterns that contrasted each other, which Joseph thought looked ghastly. He was all for adding some foo-for-ah to one's attire, but these men went too far. The citizens he'd passed had given him a wide range of looks and reactions. The young ladies had smiled at him in appreciation, batting their eyes and looking coy, while the matrons had gasped in shocked indignation or fright and pulled their younger counterparts to the opposite side of the street. Most of the men he'd passed had reacted similarly, either nodding at him in respect or cowering until they passed. He'd have to get a change of clothes and spiff up a bit if he wanted to fit in and not draw too much attention to himself. Joseph scanned the bank's interior as he walked to the man sitting at a desk, shuffling papers to and fro like he kept tab of the Pharaoh's accounts or something. Joseph stood before the desk and waited while the fellow wrote notes and muttered to himself. Joseph cleared his throat, causing the man to look up at him with a look of frustration, his pen pausing in midair. "May I help you?" The ingrate toned in a nasal voice, looking Joseph up and down in question. "I'd like to speak with the manager," Joseph replied. "Do you have an appointment?" He sneered. "Nope, just landed in town." Joseph chuckled to himself. The man rolled his eyes and huffed, flipping through a calendar, causing Joseph to about read the clerk a page from the good book. "Mr. Wright is much too busy to see you, but I can put you on his schedule 2 weeks from tomorrow." Joseph squinted his eyes. He'd never experienced such outright disrespect as what exuded off this man. In the wilderness, one earned disrespect. Sure, there were some bad apples no one wanted to be around, but those men kept to themselves. They were not employed to greet customers at the door. Most men he knew would rip this fellow in half for his attitude, then put him back together to make sure he learned the lesson well. Joseph slammed the heavy haversack on the desk, letting it open a few inches to reveal the gold hiding within. He leaned over the desk with all the power he'd built in the rugged mountains, boring a hole within the rude man's eyes. Joseph looked to his sack, making sure the man's eyes followed. When the clerk's eyes lit up in surprise, Joseph whispered low and dangerous, "I'll be speaking with the manager now and in private. Run along and get him for me." The man spilled out of his chair, mumbling something about Joseph taking a seat while he fetched the manager. He returned mere minutes later and ushered Joseph up the stairs to an office that sat at the end of the hall. The clerk knocked and opened the door. After seeing Joseph in, Joseph swore he saw the man bow to him as he backed away. Joseph sighed, hating the fact that money made a man worthy. To Joseph's way of thinking, money was only a vestige of power. Power came from one's character and how they walked through this life with others. He vowed to himself that as soon as he'd done what God had sent him here to do and got back to his mountains, no one but his family would know about the riches he dug from the earth. Gold held no real meaning in life anyway, just made things easier. Shelves of books lined the walls of the office, and it smelled of sweet tobacco. A man with broad shoulders and graying hair sat behind a desk in front of a wall of windows that overlooked the street below. He stood and walked with purpose around the desk, holding his hand out. "James Wright at your service," he remarked. "You made quite the impression on our Mr. Fink out there. How can the Pittsburgh Trust and Savings Company assist you today?" "I'd like to open an account. I'd like it to earn interest, and considering I live out west in the Rockies, I'd like to be able to communicate privately with someone often about the state of the account," Joseph said, shaking Mr. Wright's hand. "What brings you to Pittsburgh, and how much are you looking to deposit?" Mr. Wright asked as he went back to his desk, motioning for Joseph to take a seat. "God brought me here, and on the second I haven't figured that out yet." "Maybe you could help me," Joseph answered as he sat in the chair and placed the haversack on the desk with a loud clunk. Mr. Wright's eyes bulged in surprise as he stammered, "There must be 20 pounds worth of gold here." "Closer to 25, Joseph quipped. So can we do business, or should I find another bank? We most certainly can, Mr. Thomas, Mr. Wright said enthusiastically. I must gather some equipment and our assessor, then we will get down to business. If you'll excuse me, you can relax here while I do that. We can take care of business here, rather than out in the lobby. I'd appreciate that, Joseph answered. Of course, Mr. Thomas. I'll be back shortly. In the meantime, I'll have some refreshments sent up. Mr. Wright rushed out the door before Joseph could thank him. Joseph stood and scanned the books, taking in titles of finance, business, and industry. He heard a noise through the crack in the door Mr. Wright had neglected to pull shut on his haste to leave. Thinking the refreshments arrived and he'd help whoever brought them up, he moved to open the door. I'm telling you, we have to act now. The harsh whispered voice stopped Joseph in his tracks. Randall is no fool, another answered. If we act against him and don't succeed, any hope of staying in a position of power vanishes. If we don't act now, any hope of gaining power vanishes the minute they hammer the nail into that rail, the first whisperer said with force. We've talked over this before. The man is untouchable. He's too rich and embedded to take down now, plus with all his philanthropy and religion, he's looked at as a saint, the other scoffed. He's untouchable every place but one, his daughter Victoria. If we get her, he'll do anything to get her back. Anything. She'll speak tonight at a foolish equal educational rights meeting at the town hall. I say we grab her there and force his hand, the man explained. Joseph wondered at the condescending tone of the man's voice as he talked about the meeting. Joseph had never understood some men's insistence that women were inferior. He'd learned just as much, if not more, from the women he'd been acquainted with than the men. His own mother had proven women were just as capable as men, by teaching the trappers who couldn't read and do their sums to do so. She even spent time helping the Ute people they lived near learn English when they visited. Joseph slid to the crack to see who stood there. A tall, skinny man and a shorter, heavy-set man stood in the shadows, their features indistinguishable. Joseph seethed in frustration. The minute she's back in her daddy's arms, we'd be dead, the shorter man stated, shaking his head. Not if she's never able to get back into those arms, the taller one said, poking the other in the chest. A cart at the end of the hall appeared, pushed by Mr. Fink. The men in the shadows started walking down the hall away from Joseph's location. He listened, hoping Mr. Fink would give him a hint to their identities, but the infernal man just nodded his head to them as he passed. One thing became plain: Joseph's evening would be spent attending a meeting for equal educational rights and saving some frilly lady from death. Then he'd finish with God's mission and figure out how he would get home. Chapter 3. Victoria rushed down Diamond Street toward City Hall, her blue silk brocade dress swishing as her legs moved at a speed any well-meaning matron of the city was sure to inform her father of. However, she couldn't worry about that at the moment, with her on the verge of being late to the most important meeting she'd had to date. She chided herself at the ridiculous time she'd wasted getting ready, but she wanted to pose a picture of not only intelligence but also elegance when she gave her speech on the importance of equal educational rights for girls. For that, and her own confidence as sake, she donned her favorite dress and her maid styled her hair just right. "Please, Mrs. Leader, can you try to keep up?" she asked her father's cousin and Victoria's chaperone, whom she loathed to take everywhere, not that she didn't like the dear lady who wheezed next to her in a murky brown dress and a favored flowered hat Victoria found hideous. Mrs. Leader had moved in when living with her crazy mother, Victoria's great-aunt, had become too taxing. Victoria's complaint fell on the need for a chaperone at all. She longed for the freedom to live unencumbered by the restraints society tied around her. She sometimes wished she could escape it altogether and live like the Bedouin people she read about, free to live among the wilderness. Victoria's appearance would most likely be ruined with her quick walk blowing her hair every which way, and her face flushed apple red from the exertion. She slowed her walk at that thought, not wanting her face to be blotchy and sweaty when she took the stage. Mrs. Leader wheezed as she caught up and walked beside Victoria. Victoria praised God that her father still considered it important to live close to his work like many other affluent men of Pittsburgh, since the City Hall was an easy walk from their home on 5th Street. She assumed he'd want to build a home out on Squirrel Hill like so many were now doing, but she hoped that would be a while yet. She would miss not being within easy walking distance of everything. The City Hall came into view, and Victoria spied Harriet Carter, the meeting's organizer, greeting people as they came to the door. She breathed a sigh of relief and smiled at her friend and mentor. When Harriet had asked her to join the movement to allow girls to receive the same education boys got, Victoria had flung herself in head first. Her own father had taken Victoria's education seriously, not only having her taught the classics and etiquette, but also science and business against her tutor's wishes. She'd even taken classes, thanks to her father's influence, at the Western University of Pennsylvania. Though she knew her father's power and money granted her that opportunity, she remained convinced it should be a privilege afforded to all girls and young women. "There you are," Harriet exclaimed as she reached for Victoria's hands and gave her a quick kiss on the cheek. "I began to worry you would not get here in time. Could your father not make it?" "Forgive me, Harriet. My father received an urgent message he had to take care of, so he won't be able to come, and I took an excessive amount of time attempting to bolster my confidence, only to have it ruined from my brisk pace to get here." Victoria laughed at herself as she lightly touched her hair. Harriet threaded her arm through Victoria's and walked into the meeting, chiding, "Nonsense, my dear, you look just as beautiful as always." "Not that it matters anyways. Men may think I have an appealing face, but the minute they realize my passion for educating girls, love of learning, and a desire for adventure, they quickly turn in search for someone more sedate. Which is quite fine by me. I'd much rather spend my time helping others than sitting at home, doing needlepoint and hosting tea parties." Victoria laughed. "You just need to find a man courageous enough to take on a challenge. I'll be praying God brings such a man to sweep you off your feet. Come, let's mingle for the few minutes we have before we get started," Harriet declared, as she dragged Victoria into the crowd. Victoria made her way through the people gathered, which numbered smaller than she had hoped. As she chatted with a reporter from the Pittsburgh Daily Post, she noticed a man walk in. While he dressed like any other man there, though more somber in black trousers that hugged his legs, a black frock coat and a splendid dark blue vest, he had a rugged and wild air about him. She supposed it must be the pleasing full auburn beard, but it seemed more the way he held himself and scanned the room as if in search of prey. A shiver chased up her spine, and she couldn't tell whether from fear or excitement. At that moment, Harriet's husband took the stage and requested everyone find a seat. Victoria went to the stage and took her seat next to Harriet, behind the podium. She would speak last of the three speakers and was the only woman speaker. At first she felt honored that she'd give the closing speech, but now that she sat in front of this crowd, she wished she had requested to go first. She glanced at the crowd as the first speaker started, noticing quite a few faces twisted in scorn. Would this meeting turn ugly with naysayers and protesters? She prayed not, for the speakers only wished to encourage progress. Victoria fiddled with her glove, then stopped the erratic motion, vowing that she would not allow her nerves nor the scorn of others to diminish her resolve. She peered out into the crowd again, her gaze arresting on the piercing stare of the stranger she had noted coming in before. He sat near the front of the crowd, and his intense blue eyes searched her with an open inquisitiveness. No derision or scorn appeared. After she stared at him for more moments than proper, his lips curved into the most subtle yet inviting smile that caused Victoria's own mouth to curve in return. Her heart thudded in her chest as she looked down at her gloved hands, then up to the speaker, where her attention should be. She chided herself that now was not the time to have flittings of the heart or brazen flirtations. She sat here for a purpose, and it had nothing to do with the exciting danger sitting in the second row. Joseph's purpose slammed hard in his chest. He recognized it the instant he spotted the striking young lady taking a seat on the stage. He tried to figure out what about her made him feel like the Holy Spirit tugged on his brain real hard to get his attention. It seemed as if his entire life, every trial and hardship he'd gone through, ended tied up and accumulating into her. He consciously knew it sounded loco, but God laid a straight path to her in his heart, and who was he to deviate from it? Joseph attempted to listen to the speakers, but his gaze and attention went back to the beauty in the blue dress, the color of his mountain sky. He wondered if the men had plotted against her, or the woman sitting next to her. After 2 speakers, the meeting director moved to the podium and said, "And last, I'd like to welcome Miss Victoria Reming to the podium." With some sedate clapping and a few grumbles, he had his answer, as the woman he'd spent most of the meeting staring at, Victoria Reming, walked to the podium. Joseph listened with rapt attention as she expounded the importance of educating girls in the same capacity as boys. He marveled at her intricate reasoning and strength of conviction. He wondered at people who still believed women less capable intellectually than men. Sure, men had more brute strength, though he'd even questioned that with the men sitting in this room, but some of the most intelligent people he knew, white or Indian, were women without a doubt. Miss Reming finished her speech, and several hands shot up. Joseph chuckled as her eyebrows, the same roasted chestnut shade as her hair, winged up as her expressive green eyes widened. It appeared clear she hadn't expected questions, but offered quick retorts and wit. The good-looking man he'd watched women fawn over before the start of the meeting shot his hand up and said, "Miss Reming, it sounds as if you want women to join the distinguished calling of doctors, lawyers, or journalists when they should be home keeping house. Many women already labor outside of the home. While Pittsburgh doesn't have the cotton mills like other cities, and women certainly aren't working at the steel factories, many of them work in dressmakers' shops or as domestic servants. They work long, draining hours, then return home exhausted only to work long, draining hours at home. I've spoken with many of them, and they are intelligent enough for the professions you stated. If given even the basics of education, they could succeed at an occupation that won't leave them a shell of who they were or dead far too early," Miss Reming answered, smiling tight at the slick snake. "That is quite a jump from servant to doctor or even the humble journalist. You honestly believe a woman has the strength of spirit to operate on injured people, or the political understanding to write articles about scandal, murder, or disease outbreaks? Why, most women I know would faint at the slightest cut, let alone a bloody crime scene. A woman journalist might write bits of poetry or recipes or such nonsense, but there is no way a woman could write compelling stories that sell newspapers," the man said, in a condescending tone that caused Joseph to prepare to help the man exit if he became too bothersome. Miss Reming's eyes sharpened, and Joseph sensed power and determination pouring from her. She became a mountain lion, crouched and waiting for an opening to pounce. She smiled a deceptively sweet smile, and Joseph braced for the attack. "Have you read the articles of Victor Reynolds that appear in your paper, the Gazette, Mr. Snelling?" Miss Reming questioned. "Of course I have," the man chuckled. "Everyone who can read has read his compelling exposure of brutal treatment of children and the threat of tension between the states. Why his discovery of the dirty police covering up murders and taking bribes still circulates about the city, but I do not see how that matters here. You see, sir, if you had half the journalistic instincts that the acclaimed writer has, you'd already be placing the pieces together that I, Victoria Reming, am Victor Reynolds. I've written under a pen name, and not a brilliant one at that." Miss Reming beamed at the sputtering man. "I thank you for the kind compliments on my journalistic expertise, and also on proving my point. If given the opportunity to learn, women are just as intelligent as men." With that, she returned to her seat to a cacophony of applause and shouted questions. She had pounced well, causing the man to slither out the room in the chaos. As the meeting closed, Joseph kept in the shadows as people rushed to talk with Miss Reming. She answered with grace and kindness to everyone, even those who criticized her speech with rudeness. Joseph noticed she kept scanning the crowd. He watched the people as they milled about the room. He tried to recognize the two men he'd overheard in the hallway, but none of them looked familiar, though in all honesty he had seen nothing that would help him in his search. He listened for their voices, but in the discord of conversations that echoed around the room, Joseph wondered how anyone could understand what the other said. Joseph saw Miss Reming scan the room again. She sighed, her shoulders sagging a bit. She turned to the woman that had sat next to her, speaking something to her. They hugged, and Miss Reming walked towards the exit. A smaller, plump lady that looked like a frazzled whistle pig with her muted tan dress that reminded him of mountain dirt and a hat adorned with ugly flowers followed close to her. Joseph trailed behind, wanting to make sure she got to her carriage unharmed. He watched from within the doorway when she turned to walk down the street instead of approaching the carriages that lined the walk. Why in the world would she walk, and with only Mrs. Marmot as a chaperone? Joseph rushed to follow, keeping close enough to come to her aid, but far enough not to frighten her. Chapter 4. Victoria marched down the boardwalk, her shoulders pushed back and her spirits soaring. She wondered if this was how her father responded after brokering a merger or purchasing a company. If so, she now understood the sense of power that came from socking it to them. She considered it a little sneaky confronting Mr. Snelling, or Mr. Smelling as she secretly called him like she had, but the arrogant man deserved it. Not only for his high-handed attitude, but also for his less-than-stellar journalism. Victoria hoped with her revealing her identity, she'd be able to get rid of the pen name altogether. It would be a joy to see her name attached to the articles that so many were attributing, with the movement of civil compassion and justice. She slowed when she realized it would likely do the opposite. With people now knowing that she wrote those articles, not Victor Reynolds, her journalism days were probably over. Even if they had respected Victor, that would change when she became Victoria. Stumbling, she shook off that distressing thought, not being able to do anything about it now, and continued her inventory of the night's events. That brought Victoria right back to the man that had captured her thoughts and her attention through all the speeches, including hers. She'd had difficulty remembering her points as he looked at her with open admiration and respect. She worried for Smelling as the stranger had grown tenser and tenser, like a cat stalking its prey preparing to pounce. She almost wished the insidious man's retorts had turned nasty, just to see the stranger in action. Unfortunately, though, the evening had ended, and try as she might, she hadn't seen hide nor hair of the stranger when the meeting finished. She supposed she'd scared off another man, him not even willing to engage in conversation, because of her unconventional tendencies. No matter. If a man lacked a strength and confidence in character to seek past or even embrace her oddities, then he lacked qualities of the man for her. With a resolute nod, she continued her march, invigorated by her internal bolstering. Victoria started as a carriage halted next to her. Two men jumped out of the already open door, the closest one grabbing her upper arm, the other knocking poor Mrs. Leader to the ground. Victoria's scream bound in her throat as the intriguing man from the meeting entered the fray. He wrenched the man's hand from her arm, pushing her behind himself in a protective move. The stranger then twisted the assailant's arm until she heard a horrible crack and a scream. As the second man came at her rescuer brandishing a knife, her rescuer disarmed the attacker without effort, thrusting his fist into the second man's face. The assailant fell to the boardwalk knocked out cold, and the carriage raced away. Victoria sucked in a gasp as her savior finally turned to her. His appearance of intense concern kicked her heartbeat up from a galloping horse to the speed of a racing freight train. She wasn't sure what affected her more, the attack or the man standing before her. "Are you all right?" he asked, not even winded from the exertion. Unable to find her voice, Victoria nodded her head. Her head spun like the time she had looked down after climbing to the top of the large oak in their backyard. She moved her hand to her head and winced at the sharp pain that radiated from where the man had gripped her on her arm. "Mrs. Leader!" Victoria exclaimed, turning to assist Mrs. Leader, who grunted and wheezed a whistle from where she struggled on the ground. The stranger quickly went to the dear older lady and helped her to her feet. He grabbed her hat, the ugly flowers sticking from it horribly disarrayed, and handed it to Mrs. Leader, who still whistled wheezes as she clutched her heart. A slight smile hitched the side of the stranger's mouth, and Victoria wondered what he found amusing. Mrs. Leader took her hat with a shaky hand and placed it rather crookedly on her head. "Would you ladies permit me to escort you home?" her mystery man asked, extending his elbow for her to take. Victoria hesitated, looking to the ground where the men still laid. One writhed in pain on the boardwalk as he clutched his arm, while the other lay unconscious at his side. She looked back up at the stranger, thinking it may be more dangerous with him than by themselves. "Come, let's leave this refuse and get you home." "I promise I mean you no harm," he said. "Thank you, kind sir," Mrs. Leader answered before Victoria could protest. Mrs. Leader slipped her arm in the man's elbow, then looked at Victoria in expectation. Victoria cautiously placed her hand on his arm. His hard, very muscled arm. He definitely was not a man of society, as she was used to. "You dispatched those men with no effort," she said, attempting to keep her voice level. "Oh, that." He chuckled. "That was nothing. I'm Victoria Reming, but I suppose you already know that, and this is Mrs. Abigail Leader," Victoria said. "Joseph Thomas." Mr. Thomas smiled over at her. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Reming." "The pleasure is all mine, I can assure you," Victoria replied, glad her voice had found its way from her throat. "Thank you for rescuing us back there. I'm not sure what that was all about. I didn't think I incited that strong of emotions at the meeting tonight." "You incited a lot of things tonight, Miss Reming," Mr. Thomas declared with a warm expression in his eyes that turned her knees to pudding and her stomach to butterflies. "But that attack relates to your father, not your impassioned speech." "My father?" Victoria asked, surprised. "Why would my attack be because of my father?" Mr. Thomas glanced at her. She knew the look he wore on his face, the one that said he wouldn't be telling her any time soon. A look her father often got. A look she often worked around. "Why don't I explain when we get to your home and your father?" Joseph answered, wanting to divert that conversation so he'd only need to explain once. "So, you are a journalist and an activist?" "Yes, though I didn't mean to let out the journalist bit of information." Miss Reming sighed. "I suppose Mr. Snelling, got the better of me." Joseph laughed out loud at her slip of tongue. "Smelling is right." He reeked of pomposity. Victoria snorted a laugh, covering her mouth with her delicate gloved hand. She looked at him with embarrassment and humor vying for her expression. He grinned like a fool, his heart captured by the intriguing woman at his side. Mrs. Leader tsked on his other side, clicking like the whistle pigs did with their teeth. "It's a good thing that nonsense finally came out. You know, dear, your journalism days are done." "I would very much like to read your articles," Joseph stated, choosing to turn attention away from Mrs. Leader's comment, which had put a crease of sadness upon Victoria's face. "If they are half as intelligent as your speech, it's no wonder Smelling pontified Victor Reynolds' excellence." "Have you never read one of her articles?" "They've been brandished all about the city, even the steel workers are reading them," Mrs. Leader asked, surprised. "I just landed in town this morning." "Literally." Joseph chuckled to himself. "And what brings you to our booming city, if I may be so bold?" Victoria asked. She stopped in front of a residence and looked up into his eyes. He'd never realized someone could have eyes such a vivid shade of spring green. Her hair, a beautiful roasted chestnut color, was curled and piled on top of her head like an intricate coil, begging release one pin at a time. "I'm not sure of God's plans for me in Pittsburgh, but I'm beginning to have a good idea," Joseph replied, hoping he expressed his intrigue and desire for her in his gaze. "Well," she whispered, "shall we see if Father is back yet? This mystery has me positively on edge." Victoria sighed as a slight blush tinted her cheeks. Mrs. Leader cleared her throat loudly. Victoria blinked twice and turned towards the residence. Chapter 5. "Good evening, George. Has Father made it home yet?" Victoria asked as she pulled off her gloves and placed them on the side table by the door. "He just arrived," George stated in his clipped tone that most would find rude, but she found endearing, especially since she knew him to be a man who loved deeply but was stoic in nature. "He just sat down in the parlor." "Perfect," Victoria replied, heading down the hall to the parlor. "Victoria, I believe I will retire for the evening. That entire episode has me frazzled," Mrs. Leader commented as she headed for the stairs. "I understand, Mrs. Leader. I pray you feel well in the morning," Victoria answered, turning into the parlor. "Father, I have someone I think you should meet," Victoria called as she entered the room, the air thick with pipe smoke and the faint smell of brandy. Her mother had finished decorating the lavish area shortly before she died. A lush deep green velvet upholstered the comfortable chairs and couch, and a dark coffee wallpaper covered the walls, creating a room as cozy as a cave. Her father loved the room because he stated it didn't encroach on his masculine sensibilities, with dainty chairs, rickety tables, and flowers growing up the walls. Victoria loved the room because of the fond memories of curling up on the couch with a book and a single lantern, reading deep into the night of grand adventures on the western frontier, until her father would come in and find her sleeping with the book laying on her chest. The room always felt warm and inviting, and she half imagined her mother sitting with them some nights, tea-esking at her father's pipe. Her father lounged in his favorite chair, an empty brandy snifter resting on the mahogany table next to him, and his pipe jutting from his mouth, puffing like the locomotives he owned. His gray hair stuck out in all directions, as if he'd run his hands through his hair in frustration. He still wore his red plaid vest, though his tie hung limply from his collar. He folded the newspaper he read, placed it next to his empty cup, and rose from his chair with a sigh. "How'd your meeting go, dear? I'm so sorry I got called away and couldn't see you in action." Her father smiled fondly at her as he grabbed her shoulders and gave her a peck on the cheek, making Victoria wish again that others could see her father as the caring man he was, instead of the stern businessman he presented in public. "It went well. My speech seemed well received, though I may have caused a bit of a stir when I accidentally told the crowd I was Victor Reynolds," Victoria replied sheepishly. Her father's laugh burst from his lips as he threw his head back. "I can't wait to hear all about it, but first, would you like to introduce your guest?" Victoria looked back at Joseph, who glanced between them as his smile grew. She turned her body to include him. He surprised her with how comfortable he seemed in her father's presence. Most people wore a sheen of nervousness when they met him. Even many he called friends still had a bit of skittishness to them. Did he not know anything about her father, like he hadn't read any of her articles that had blazed across the city? "Father, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Joseph Thomas." Mr. Thomas escorted us home after the meeting. "Mr. Thomas, this is my father, Mr. Randall Remming," Victoria introduced. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Remming," Mr. Thomas stated as he walked purposely across the oriental rug and shook her father's hand. "Yes, well, the pleasure is all mine," her father's eyes widened in surprise by Mr. Thomas's confidence. "Please sit and get comfortable. Can I get you a brandy or some coffee?" "Coffee, please." "Thank you," Mr. Thomas answered. As her father walked to the cord to ring the housekeeper, he asked, "Now, how did you two meet? I don't recognize you from our social gatherings." "Mr. Thomas rescued me on my walk home from two thugs bent on whisking me away in their carriage," Victoria casually stated. Her father turned to look between the two of them. A line creasing his forehead showed the concern he kept buried within. Victoria watched as his mouth grew tighter the longer he looked at her. Then he turned his attention toward Mr. Thomas, his eyes narrowed slightly in scrutiny. A parlor maid walked into the room, startling slightly at father, standing right in the door. "Please bring a cart of coffee and refreshments," father commanded in a stern voice without taking his eyes off Mr. Thomas. "Right away, sir," the maid muttered before bowing and leaving the room. Her father stalked over to his chair, sat down on the edge, and leveled both Victoria and Mr. Thomas with a stare that succeeded in intimidating her. Mr. Thomas, however, sat with a look of intensity on his own face. "Explain yourself, Victoria," her father commanded. As Victoria explained the attack, spending much detail on how deftly Mr. Thomas had neutralized it, her father's face bloomed into a red rage, while Mr. Thomas's blushed into a subtle pink. Victoria congratulated herself on finally getting a reaction from the unflappable man. "When I stated that I couldn't believe someone would react so violently to my speech, even with my slip about my journalistic endeavors, Mr. Thomas replied that the attack had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with you, father," Victoria finished. Her father turned his bulging eyes on Mr. Thomas and spoke in an even voice that strained. "Explain yourself, Mr. Thomas." Mr. Thomas leaned forward in his chair. "Earlier today, I overheard a conversation at the Pittsburgh Trust and Savings Company. Two men discussed how they needed to get the upper hand on you, sir. They decided attacking your only weakness was their only option to get what they wanted." Both men turned to look at Victoria, who pointed at herself and asked in shock, "Me?" Mr. Thomas nodded and continued. "They knew by taking you after your meeting, your father would do anything they wanted." As her father nodded, he replied, "Did you see who spoke?" "No, they stood in shadows until they left with their backs to me. I hoped the man passing them in the hall would greet them, but he didn't give me any clue to whom the men were," Mr. Thomas said, as he slid back in his chair with a hint of dejection. "So you attended the meeting hoping to thwart their attack?" Victoria's father asked. "I knew God had allowed me to overhear their conversation for a purpose. Since the men never said your name, I figured I'd take myself to the meeting and see if I could intercept them," Mr. Thomas explained. "They were correct in their thinking. If Victoria were taken, I'd do just about anything to get her back," her father agreed. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming to her aid, though I'm sure you had better things to do." At that point, the maid rolled the coffee cart in. Victoria rose to intercept her, smiling her thanks. She needed something to do to ground her after Mr. Thomas's revelation. Mr. Thomas shook his head with such sorrow, and Victoria's heart dropped as he asserted, "They weren't planning on returning her, and if you ask me, they won't stop because I thwarted them." The cup of coffee slipped from her hand and the floor rushed to her as everything turned black. Joseph watched Victoria teeter and jumped from the chair, catching her inches from the floor. He lifted her slight weight into his arms, marveling at how she fit perfect there. A glance at Mr. Reming told him the man hadn't even registered the problem with him still sitting in the chair, his pipe dangling from his lower lip, which hung wide in shock. The men of this area seemed ill-prepared for trouble. Joseph placed her on the soft couch, his hand gently lingering on the side of her face. The Lord created a masterpiece when He created her. Joseph thanked Him for letting him help her in her time of need. "Will she be all right?" Mr. Reming asked, plucking his pipe from his lips a second before it tumbled to the carpet. "I imagine so," Joseph said, taking one last look at her before returning to his chair. Victoria moaned and her eyes fluttered open. Mr. Reming walked over to her and sat on the edge of the couch. With great care he brushed her hair back from her face and smiled. "Well, my dear, I guess the excitement of the day caught up to you," he declared. "Maybe you should retire for the evening." Victoria pushed her father's hand away with a huff and sat up, exclaiming, "Absolutely not. I'm not retiring until we figure out why these men are doing this and what we mean to do about it." Mr. Reming sighed so deep it must have come from his toes. Joseph smiled at her spunk and grit. Why had some man not snatched her up and married her yet? He understood those of society started grooming their daughters for marriage at a young age. Victoria's beauty rivaled the most picturesque mountain sunrise, and she had to be at least 19, so why hadn't someone reeled her in? Joseph mentally shrugged. These men's idiocy became his gain. His mind stalled on that thought. Could he be contemplating marrying the vivacious Victoria Remming after only knowing her a few hours? No, not contemplating, bound and determined to. He sat up straighter with purpose. Now to figure out how to convince her. Victoria grabbed her father's hand where it sat beside her on the couch and asked, "Father, why are these men trying to get to you? What do they want?" Mr. Remming exhaled again and ran his hand through his hair, sending tufts to stick out like a porcupine. He turned on the couch and patted his daughter's hand. He appeared reluctant to divulge the situation, making the hairs on the back of Joseph's neck to raise to attention. Some investors and board members feel that without me involved in certain ventures, their rise to fortune would rapidly increase, Mr. Remming explained. Right now they are just a vestige of power, but with me out of the picture, they'd access the money I'd leave behind and grasp the power with both hands. Joseph scoffed. True power comes from the character of a man and the Lord. The amount of money you collect has nothing to do with it. Mr. Remming smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. I couldn't agree more, though most in my circle would disagree with you. I can't give in to their demands. Too many greedy hearts would ruin the companies I'm involved in and crush those laborers who work for us. I work hard to make sure the people whose backs my companies are built on receive a decent compensation for their toils. With me gone, the others would drain the workers dry, asking more of them than reasonable, all for the sake of more profit in their pockets. In the past, others threatened and even attacked me. Their frequency has increased as the years go by. Why, that's where I was tonight, dealing with a threat that couldn't wait until morning. But they've always focused on me, never on you, my dear. Why the sudden shift in focus? Joseph asked. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company will connect a new line to Pittsburgh later this summer. My enemies expect if they can get me off the board of directors and force me to sell my stock, they'll be in the perfect position when the line opens up more industry than anyone can imagine. If they're willing to come after you, we need to get you safe. Victoria shrugged. So we'll hire someone to protect me. We'd need to hire an entire team of men to protect you. These men simply will increase the number they hire to take you. Mr. Remming shook his head. Mr. Thomas could be my bodyguard. With the way he dispatched these ruffians earlier, I'd be perfectly safe, Victoria said, looking at him in earnest. Joseph tried to keep his chest from puffing like a proud rooster. That could work, at least until we think of something else. What do you say, Mr. Thomas? Could I hire you to protect my daughter? Mr. Remming asked, a look of expectation on his face. Mr. Remming, I'm honored that you would consider me for such an important position as this. If you will allow, I need to retire for the evening and pray God's direction. I have a home and life in the shining mountains. I need to know if this is the direction God wishes me to take, not something my emotions are leading me to, Joseph replied, staring at Victoria in contemplation. I respect a man who seeks God's wisdom in major decisions. How about we meet back here for dinner around noon tomorrow? Mr. Remming said. That would be fine by me. Joseph stood and strode to Mr. Remming, extending his hand to shake it. It was a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Remming. Likewise, and thank you, young man, for helping my Victoria. It's a rare man who would go to the lengths you did to keep a stranger safe, Mr. Remming said, clasping Joseph's hand in both of his. You're welcome, Joseph replied, turning to Victoria and taking her hand. Miss Remming, I'm glad you are safe and unharmed. I look forward to visiting tomorrow. As Joseph placed a kiss upon her hand, he looked into her expressive face. He knew he'd do anything to keep her safe, and wouldn't be able to leave to his mountains with the threat looming over her. Though God had brought him here, Joseph couldn't discern what he willed, at least with those spring-green eyes staring raptly at him with such hope. Chapter 6. Joseph strode to the Reming residence with new purpose. All night he'd been on his knees in prayer on the hotel room floor, asking God to direct his path. When the thready strains of pink had pushed through the night sky, Joseph received his answer. Now he just had to convince Victoria and her father it remained the best option available. Joseph slowed as he approached the house, noticing a man leaning against a building reading a paper. The man lowered the paper, and Joseph recognized one of the men from the night before by the bruise spread across his face. Joseph turned away quickly and walked to the end of the block, counting the houses as he strode forward. He turned the corner and quickly headed down the street, tucking into the alley that went behind the houses. He scaled the fence to the Reming's house when the gate proved locked, just like he scaled the mountains he crossed back home. Joseph knocked on the back door. A round woman with her hair pulled back tight and a messy apron over her gray dress answered. She cocked an eyebrow at Joseph, looking him up and down. "May I help you?" she asked. "Could you tell Mr. and Miss Reming that Joseph Thomas is here to speak with them?" Joseph asked, pulling his hat from his head. "Why in the world are you coming to the back door?" the cook asked, ushering him in. "Well, the front is being watched. I didn't want anyone to know I'm here," Joseph answered. The sense of whatever was cooking assaulted his nose with a cacophony of pleasant aromas he hadn't experienced since his mother had died. His mouth salivated, and he hoped whatever the cook prepared would be served for dinner. His eyes bulged at the mound of cookies stacked upon the work table in the center of the kitchen. "Go ahead, Mr. Thomas, take one for yourself. I've sent a maid to get George to see you to the parlor." The cook pointed to the mound. Joseph grinned broadly at her and winked. "Thank you, ma'am. You, dear lady, are a lifesaver." "I'll get on with you now," she said as she shooed him off, her face pinking in a blush. Joseph chuckled as he bit into the cookie. The soft treat melted into his mouth as the rich molasses and tangy ginger danced upon his tongue. Though he knew he should savor it, the cookie was gone in 2 more bites. He brushed his sugary fingers together as he met George in the hallway. "This way, sir," George said stoically, ushering Joseph into the front of the house where a sitting room was located. Victoria lounged on a flowery couch, her feet propped up on an ottoman before her. Her mouth quirked in an amused smile as she read the book she held, one finger twirling in her chestnut hair. She was dressed in what could be called a simple, dark pink dress, though it appeared more complicated than anything he'd ever seen his mother in, with its lace upon the sleeves and thick skirts that hid everything but the soles of her feet, even propped up. He imagined what Victoria would look like in a simple calico dress, sitting in his rocker beside the fire, an amused lift upon her lips as she read into the evening. His heart warmed at the thought. George cleared his throat. "Mr. Thomas is here, Miss Reming." Victoria looked up, and the amused smile turned into a radiant beam as she rose from the couch and approached. His heart boiled and threatened to explode like the geyser he'd seen when he'd traveled north above the Oregon Trail. The ridiculous bow tie lassoed around his neck cinched tighter the closer she came. He doubted any man could survive feeling hot and choked by the approach of a woman, and suddenly understood the reason men escaped into the mountains. "Good morning, Mr. Thomas. Father sent a message that he's running a bit behind schedule. Would you like a cup of coffee or tea while we wait?" Victoria asked, motioning for him to sit. Joseph questioned the sanity of staying within this stifling room, watching Victoria's every move without either passing out from lack of air or blurting some inane declaration towards Victoria and whisking her off to the unknown with him. He needed air. He needed the open sky above him. "Actually, I've just come from the backyard, and the temperature hasn't risen too high yet today. Would you like to walk about the garden for a bit?" Joseph asked, desperately hoping for the space of the outdoors. Victoria's eyebrows raised in question and her eyes beamed as she answered, "That sounds lovely." As she led him out the door, Mrs. Leader approached with a slight limp and a distraught look upon her face. Victoria grabbed Mrs. Leader's arm and threaded it through hers. "Come, Mrs. Leader. We plan to take a turn about the garden. I'll get you set up on the veranda with a nice glass of lemonade, so you can rest. I happen to know your cook has a mound of delicious cookies waiting to be devoured," Joseph piped in, knowing if the chaperone refused, Victoria would most likely change their plans to accommodate the older woman, who seemed still unhinged by the previous night's encounter. "That sounds quite lovely," Mrs. Leader answered, her limp becoming more pronounced as she leaned upon Victoria. Joseph stifled a grin as he followed the ladies outside to a veranda attached to the back of the house. Once Mrs. Leader was settled on a cozy chair with a magazine, and the maid had been called to bring refreshments, Victoria led him out the door to the garden, her mouth turned up soft and inviting. "The roses are particularly lovely this year," Victoria remarked as she turned to him on the cobblestone path. Joseph grunted, his tongue tied by the beauty standing before him. "Come, let me show you," she said as she chuckled and threaded her arm through his. Joseph questioned the intelligence of suggesting a walk around the garden. Without the furniture as a buffer, and her small delicate hand gently wrapped around his bicep, he wondered if the whole world would collapse on him. The heat of the day suddenly seemed 20 degrees warmer than a few minutes before, his frock coat stifling him. He wanted to escape to his shining mountains where the air remained crisp and clean, and the mountains sang God's glory. Yet, as Victoria's hand tightened on his arm and she glanced up at him from under long chestnut lashes, her green eyes sparkling in delight, he knew he could never return alone again. Victoria's breath hitched in her chest as Joseph's muscle flexed beneath her hand. She flushed with heat and wondered why her bodice suddenly felt 2 sizes too tight. Was it the warm weather and humidity of the day, or the man beside her that had her throat dry and her palms sweating? She could gulp an entire glass of lemonade and doubted it would cool her. Determined not to become some vapid ninny, Victoria cleared her throat. "Please tell me about out west, Mr. Thomas. I've read so many books and accounts of life out there, and find it utterly fascinating." Mr. Thomas looked at her with such joy on his face, she prayed he didn't notice how slick with sweat her hands instantly became. She curled her toes in her shoes to focus her attention away from his handsome face with its strong lines, auburn beard, and blue eyes that penetrated deep into her soul and chased away intelligent thought. She thanked the good Lord she hadn't succumbed to such ridiculousness throughout her years, like so many of her acquaintances. She couldn't imagine how the women ever had a rational thought, with how her own brains had turned to mush with just a smile and a touch from Mr. Thomas. Whoever called them the shining mountains were right. They fairly sparkle with lakes glittering like jewels, birds serenading the forest, and a million stars gracing the sky at night. The air is clean and light, not smoggy and heavy like the air here. I've never experienced air like you have here, so thick I could slice a piece off and put it in my pocket for later, Mr. Thomas said as he shook his head in wonder. "The noise is hard for me here too. Back home it can be so silent you wonder if you're the only one in the world, or it can be so full of song and chatter from the critters roaming about and the wind dancing through the trees that you can hardly hear yourself think." Mr. Thomas chuckled. "How did you end up there?" Victoria asked, fascinated by the man beside her, who talked of the earth with such poetry one minute and dispatched evil men with little exertion the next. "My father was a coureurs de bois, a woods runner who came out from New York City when he was young." Mr. Thomas exhaled a laugh, shaking his head in disbelief, the love for his father evident in the soft smile upon his face. He decided when he was 14 that he was sick of the city and wanted the adventure of the West. He made his way out there, hitching up with others when he could. A French trapper took pity on him and took him under his wing, said my pa was a fighter worth saving. He spent the next 14 years becoming a Hiverano, a free trapper known up and down the Rockies for his skill and bravery. Not a campfire was lit that didn't include a story of Pa, whether it was true or not. I'd love to hear one. Victoria couldn't help that her smile grew as she thought of how Mr. Thomas's love for his father shone in his eyes. The cord binding them closer and closer tightened. She felt the same consuming affection for her own father. Mr. Thomas obliged, looking out over the garden as he began. Late one summer, he came upon a group of missionaries bent on setting up a trading post to minister to the natives in the wilds of the West. The group had hit hard times, their guide having died in an accident, and the rest of the scouts were too green to get them over the mountains safely. Pa guided them into Flathead Post, then headed home with a new bride. Victoria gasped, the surprise of the story bringing her joy. How romantic! Yes, my pa and ma fell in love on that journey, despite the hardships. They returned to my pa cabin south of the White River. It wasn't an easy life, but it seemed fulfilling. We often went to the Ute people to visit, my ma teaching them English, and them teaching her about healing herbs and plants that could be foraged for food. I still visit the Utes several times a year, teaching them the white words and ways, so as more settlers invade their homeland, they may be able to live like we have as friends. I know most don't care what becomes of the Indians, willing to push them into lands they've never been to when their homelands prove bountiful, but I want to give them a chance to work with the whites coming in by giving them the power of language. Purpose roared loudly within Victoria's heart, Mr. Thomas's declaration a reflection of her own desire for others to learn. Victoria longed to see the Ute people, to learn from them and teach them in return. She knew the thought was silly, but it lodged itself there in her spirit. What a fantastic adventure that would be, just as fascinating as the Bedouin, and on American soil to boot. Are your parents still living there? Victoria asked. No, they've both passed on to our eternal reward some years ago, Mr. Thomas said. They were visiting the Utes when influenza spread through the people. They stayed and helped, but by the time they got sick, they were so exhausted they didn't make it. I was up north when it happened, taking our winter haul to the post. I know they're up in heaven, singing and dancing with the angels, but I sure do miss them. I miss my mother still as well. I can go weeks without thinking about her, then get hit with a memory. Now though, the memories are mostly happy, some a little bittersweet. They aren't crippling like they used to be, praise God. Victoria sighed, leaning into Mr. Thomas a bit more, as he placed his hand upon hers. You said last night in your speech that you teach at the local orphanage. Do you go often? Mr. Thomas asked, looking down at her as if her answer was important to him, his expression open and interested. I'm not able to go as often as I'd like, but I go once a week, Victoria answered, though her joy quickly fled with the remembrance of the letter she'd received this morning. Though, the board of directors have informed me I'm no longer welcome. Mr. Thomas pulled her to a stop, his forehead wrinkled in displeasure. Why not? It appears my journalism ventures have come to the attention of the board, leaving them concerned for the children and the negative influence I'd have on them, Victoria answered, quoting the words used in the letter that had ripped her heart from her chest. If that isn't the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Anyone who chats with you can see how kind-hearted you are, not to mention how intelligent. What, they don't want those orphans smart? They want them dumb as posts? Mr. Thomas's defense of her, the indignation clearly on his face, wrapped around her heart like a balm, soothing the rawness there. I suppose it was inevitable. I'm just surprised how quickly it happened, but when George told me Mr. Snelling's favorite errand boy delivered the message, it all made sense, Victoria's voice faltered, still not believing someone would be so hateful. Smelling did this? I think I might just swing by the newspaper office and have a word with him, Mr. Thomas said. The sharpness of his voice and the flex of his muscle beneath her hand sent a shiver up her spine, an arduous response to his protectiveness. Victoria grabbed his arm with both hands, causing him to turn towards her. Father warned me, when I insisted on pursuing journalism, that there would be consequences if the truth came out. I knew society wouldn't accept a woman journalist. I guess I was hopeful my insightful reports would overcome my need for skirts. Mr. Thomas smiled sadly at her, running his hand down her arm to squeeze her hand. The motion ignited her insides to a blaze when she just succeeded in banking the coals. Someday the work you did will matter more than your gender. Your articles ignited something in the people of this city, Victoria. Your expositions brought to light appalling situations and injustices, and were written in a way that demanded action. You're the avant-courier, the scout, so to speak. Your words will linger on people's minds, boring into their hearts, preparing the way for the change that is inevitable. I know they'll linger in mine. You read my articles? Victoria whispered, her throat tight with emotion. Every one. Had the concierge scrounged them up for me? Victoria's breath hitched as she looked at the man before her. Not only did he quickly defend her, but he also made a point to find her articles and read them. She leaned closer, pulled to him by some invisible cord. A throat cleared and George said, "Dinner is ready, miss." Mr. Thomas smiled, his eyes twinkling with mirth as her cheeks began to warm. She willed her legs to move as he placed her hand back into the crook of his arm and walked towards the house. Glancing back at the spot where they'd stood among the roses, she felt as if a part of her had been left behind, a youthfulness that spoke of naive dreams. Yet with his words of support and stories of hope, her heart felt full rather than lacking, a newness she couldn't explain. Joseph sat in the parlor once again, full from the copious amounts of food he'd eaten. Instead of being sated, his spirit zinged within him, making him alert, ready for action. He thought back to the moment in the garden, when it appeared Victoria would lean up and kiss him. His heart had raced like a herd of mustangs, like it did now from the memory. Her delight in hearing he'd read her articles had made him feel as if he'd conquered a pack of rabid wolves. He wondered how she'd react if he told her he'd tucked those articles safe into the bottom of his haversack. Mr. Remming cleared his throat where he sat in his armchair with his pipe. George informed me that you spotted one of Victoria's attackers lingering across the street. That's correct. I circled around and entered from the alley, Joseph answered as Victoria's sharp gaze swung to him. Mr. Remming nodded his head solemnly, exhaling a deep breath as he placed his pipe on the table. I've given this much thought, hours throughout the night in fact. Victoria, I've come to the conclusion that you must leave. If you aren't here, they can't hurt you. Leave. Victoria exclaimed as she exploded from the couch. I can't leave you, Father. Besides, where would I go? We have no family to speak of, and what would stop them from following me? You'll go stay with Aunt Gertrude, Mr. Remming declared. Victoria paced back and forth on the rug. You must be joking. That old bat hates me. She'll keep me locked in that stuffy old house of hers, knitting socks out of the itchiest wool, and drowning on that disgusting tea she insists on drinking all day long. Besides, everyone knows about your crazy, decrepit aunt with all the stories you tell. They would just come and get me there. She can come home with me. The words tumbled out of Joseph's mouth before he consciously formed them in his mind. He stood as both heads turned to him in shock, and walked with purpose and determination to Victoria, taking her hands in his. I realize we've just met. The truth of the matter remains that the instant I saw you, God tugged on my heart and soul so much I swear there was a cord stretching between you and me, tying us tight together. I may not know much of you, and it appears we won't have the time to court and get to know each other, but what I do perceive impresses me beyond measure. Victoria let out a soft sigh. Why, Mr. Thomas? Joseph hurried on before sense caught up. Victoria, you contain an intelligence that will challenge me, making me a better man. Your caring heart is generous, wanting others to have the same chances in life that you do. You've got grit, chasing your passions when others say you shouldn't. I've no doubt we'll be a good match. God plucked me down here for you. I'm convinced of that now, Joseph asserted. Victoria looked at him in awe and whispered, No one has ever seen me before. I see you, Victoria Reming. I see all of you, Joseph replied, placing his hand around her neck and stroking her velvety soft cheek with his thumb. Mr. Reming cleared his throat. And just where is home, young man? Joseph dropped his hand and tore his eyes from Victoria. I was born and raised in the Rocky Mountains, around the White River area, sir. Last summer God took me to a cave so full of gold, our great-grandchildren will be set for life, even if we never invested it to grow. While my house doesn't compare to this one, I built a snug cabin that overlooks a beautiful lake guarded by the jutting mountains. Joseph turned back to Victoria. I understand life will differ greatly from what you've had here, but your father's enemies won't find you there. We would live a life free of the expectations of society. You could come with me to the Utes, help me prepare them while learning from them in return. If you'd rather, we can go somewhere else, somewhere far from here, but not as remote as my home. We can buy a house and live more like you're accustomed to. Whatever you decide, I'll protect you with everything that's in me, that I can promise you. What do you say, Victoria? Will you marry me? Victoria stared up at Joseph, indecision dancing across her face. Joseph's heart beat so fast and hard, he wondered if he'd end up on the carpet in a faint. Her head started to shake, and Joseph's heart dropped into his stomach. I may be as crazy as a loon, but I feel God whispering to me it's right. Yes, Joseph, I'll marry you, Victoria answered. Relief washed over Joseph as a smile broke across his face. She'd agreed to marry him. How could he be so blessed? He pulled her in to kiss her only to be stopped by her father's loud clap and a hard slap on the shoulder. Congratulations, dear. Mr. Reming exclaimed as Joseph backed away from his fiancée. I'm glad someone finally recognizes the woman worthy of devotion you are. However, I still don't think that'll solve the problem. By the time we hold the wedding, everyone will know who you are and where to find you. Not if we get married tomorrow morning, and I know just the pastor to do it, Joseph urged. I swung by the courthouse earlier today, and a marriage license isn't necessary if the church records it. If we leave on a steamboat or by wagon sometime tomorrow dressed how we'll live in the West, no one will notice she's gone until we are halfway to the mountains. With my name being a common one, when they search for us they'll come up empty. It's perfect, Mr. Reming exclaimed. But how will I contact you? Victoria questioned, looking with remorse at her father. Will I never see or talk to you again? Father, I can't go if I'll never see you again. I have a friend, Daniel Berger, whom I trust more than a brother, Joseph said, squeezing Victoria's hand to reassure her before turning to her father. If he contacted you with funds for investing, Victoria can include letters to you. You can come to our area for hunting expeditions, and though we couldn't do it often, especially if we stay in the cabin, we could meet you different places while you are away on business. Mr. Reming nodded his agreement. That sounds like it'd work. Plus, we can make sure we take care of your grandchildren for many generations, no matter how much gold you're able to dig out of the mountains. He took a puff on his pipe before speaking again in a somber tone. I realize we won't be able to visit each other often, dear, but we wouldn't wherever you went. It'd be too dangerous. This plan, however, appears to be a divine answer to a prayer we didn't even perceive we had. Mr. Thomas, Joseph, I'd like to invite you to stay here tonight, just in case my enemies are stupid enough to come here. As Victoria embraced her father in a weepy hug, Joseph caught Mr. Reming's gaze over her head. Mr. Reming's face beseeched him to take care of his most precious treasure. He nodded his agreement with everything in him. Chapter 7. Victoria ripped the sheeting from where it wrapped around her legs. She huffed, kicked her legs free and sat up, swinging them off the edge of the bed. Attempting to sleep proved pointless. She stood and paced toward her writing desk piled with papers where her articles and stories laid waiting for publication. I must be crazy, she mumbled, pacing back towards her bed. Who marries someone they met little over a day ago? Yes, Joseph's handsome face was beyond measure, and he was strong and courageous. Yes, his friendship with the Utes stirred Victoria's spirit of adventure, and his willingness to leave his life in the wilderness for a life she was more accustomed to melted every bone in her body. Just because a man searched for her articles and enjoyed them, didn't mean she should marry him without a second thought. She turned toward the window and peered out the curtains. Pittsburgh, though quieted with the blanket of night, still carried the noise of the occasional carriage or wagon, the train yard, and the factories that rarely stopped. Though loud and noisy and dirty, she loved her grand city. Its history inspired her to adventure. A light by the building across the street caught Victoria's eye. She moved behind the curtain and peered closer. The shadows of the doorway contained a deep darkness. Light flashed again. The man's face who'd attacked her appeared in the cigar's light he dragged on. His eyes intent on the house across the street, her house. His face disappeared into the shadows, leaving Victoria with a shudder of anxiety. Victoria grabbed her robe and headed downstairs to the kitchen. She refused to stay in her room, where every creak and groan of the house would send her into a fit. She tiptoed down the hallway and stairs, making as little noise as possible, and ventured into the kitchen. She remembered Cook had placed a cake in the icebox. Victoria determined to eat a rather large slice with a glass of milk, then read in the parlor until her eyes wouldn't stay open. Staying up late into the night would do nothing for her beauty sleep, but she hoped her fiancé's apparent esteem for her would override tired and bruised eyes from lack of sleep. Victoria pushed open the door and froze. There, sitting on a stool pulled up to the center work table, was the man who'd consumed her thoughts, making it impossible to sleep. Mr. Thomas. Joseph. He peeled an orange with his long, strong fingers. Victoria's cheeks heated in a blush. She'd never blushed until this man. This wouldn't do. She walked the rest of the way into the kitchen, cleared the stone in her throat, and said, "Cook put a cake in the icebox. I planned on having a slice. Would you like some?" Joseph looked at her with eyes intent on delving into all her secrets. The cool blue Victoria found appealing, filled with a heat that could warm her all the way to her toes. He'd gotten rid of his coat, collar, and tie, unbuttoned the top of his shirt, and rolled the sleeves up to reveal hard, tanned forearms. She'd never seen a man in such a relaxed state, even her father. The kitchen seemed like both ovens blared red hot. She fanned herself and headed towards the icebox. "I'd love some, thank you," Joseph replied. "Would you like some milk as well?" "Please." Victoria reached into the icebox and inwardly sighed at the cold. Perhaps by the time she found the milk and cake, the red would disappear from her face. She found the milk bottle and turned to put it on the counter, only to lose her grip on a gasp as she bumped into Joseph. He caught the milk bottle from her hands where he stood inches from her. His fingers slid over hers in agonizing slowness. "Here," he offered. "Let me help you with that." She removed her fingers millimeter by millimeter from underneath his and whispered, "Thank you." He gave a provocative smile and placed the milk on the counter before leaning on it. Victoria found the cake much quicker than the milk and placed it next to the bottle. She fretted around the kitchen locating the plates, forks, and cups, all while he watched her. "Having trouble sleeping?" Joseph asked, his voice as deep and rich as molasses. Dear Lord, how was she ever to keep her wits about her when everything about him sent her brain skittering out the door? If she didn't pull herself together quickly, he'd decide he misspoke all those beautiful words he'd said to her earlier. She mentally scolded herself to get it together as she cut a large piece from the cake and smiled at him. It's not every day a young woman finds herself on the cusp of marrying a complete stranger and heading into the vast wilderness, Victoria replied, as she placed the cake on a plate. Thinking of you had my sheets positively in knots. Victoria dropped the server onto the counter with a clunk at the realization of what she just said. A blush hot enough to burn down the house raced up her chest and into her hairline. His burst of hearty laughter made her turn and flee for the door. Before she could get a foot on the move, his strong arm snaked around her waist and pulled her back to his chest. "I like the thought of that," he drawled, his breath dancing over the skin on her neck. "Just so you know, you had my sheets in knots as well." Victoria simultaneously gasped in shock and shivered in desire at his words and touch. "Mr. Thomas," she cried, but couldn't hold on to her sternness at his warm smile. She knew she should slap him for his impertinence, but instead warred between the desire to stay wrapped in his arms and the need to flee from embarrassment. She tensed as he stepped around her body, still holding her close, their faces inches apart. "Victoria, look at me." She sighed in resignation. She saw desire upon his face, but also adoration and respect. He brushed his hand through her hair that hung loose down her back. He leaned closer, the sweet scent of orange filling her before he placed a soft kiss upon her lips. Joy burst from her chest as he groaned, dug his hands further into her hair and deepened the kiss. Joseph backed her into the counter while trailing kisses up her jawline. He whispered her name, his voice full of awe before he claimed her mouth again. How had she existed before this man? How could she have imagined her life as happy without him in it? He softened the kiss and pulled back from her, his hands cupping her neck as his thumb caressed her cheek. Joseph exhaled with a sigh and asserted, "There's a connection between you and I believe you feel it just as deep as I do. I can't explain it, but I know without a doubt you are mine and I am yours. You are the one God made my heart to beat for, Victoria Reming. I will spend the rest of my days making you see that. With God directing our path, we will make something beautiful that lasts through the generations. I'm convinced with all my heart of that." Victoria sighed and set her head on his shoulder. He pulled her into himself and held tight. His heartbeat steady against her palm. A certainty filled her, a peace she'd rarely felt before. "I believe you might be right, Joseph Thomas." He squeezed her, kissed her on the top of the head and said, "Now how about some cake?" It took everything in Joseph not to drag her down to Pastor Hudson's that instant, nightclothes and all. Victoria's admission, and how sweet and pure she looked with her hair tumbling down her back, and the flouncy layers of her clothes removed to the basics, had him reciting the books of the Bible forward and then backward in his head. He grabbed the piece of cake, moved back to his stool, and sat his rump firm on the seat before he grabbed her and kissed her again like his body screamed to. "So what has you fretting?" Joseph asked like an idiot. Who wouldn't fret when marrying a person they didn't know and leaving to the isolated wilderness, vastly different from their home? Would Victoria be strong enough to survive the harsh environment, or was he dooming her to a life of misery or an early grave? "Mainly leaving my father and my city. It's odd to understand I wouldn't be safe here. I've never feared for my safety before. Even when I went to investigate for an article, I rarely felt uncomfortable. People live decent, moral lives. I was just thinking about how much I love it here when I glanced out the window. One of the men that attacked us was skulking in the dark doorway across the street." Victoria sighed with a shiver. Everything within Joseph became cold and alert. He tensed, placed his fork next to his plate. "How do you know that?" He was smoking. When he inhaled, the light from the cigar lit his face. He was standing there, staring at the house. Joseph moved to stand when a soft hand captured his. Her eyes pleaded. Her grip tightened. "Please don't leave me," she begged, melting him with her green eyes. "We disappear tomorrow. He won't be able to find us." "He'll still be a threat to your father," Joseph pointed out. "Yes, but with me gone, Father can hire an entire company of bodyguards without me to worry about. They don't want him dead. That would simply transfer control to others they can't manipulate to act in their favor," Victoria explained. "It doesn't sit right to leave him out there." "Please, I don't want to be alone." Victoria's hand curled around his. He marveled at how small and pale it was compared to his tanned, rough one. He turned his hand so their palms touched, His hand enclosed hers almost completely, like her life later today would become enclosed within his, bound and intertwined for eternity. Would he be enough to keep her happy in the lonely mountains? He brought his head down as he lifted her hand and kissed the delicate skin. Lord, please help me be the husband she needs. She sighed, pulled her hand back and picked up her fork. Tell me about our home. Joseph smiled at the memory of the neat cabin tucked against the mountainside. Our small one-room cabin nestles in a mountain meadow that gets blanketed in snow and hibernates in the winter. In the summer, it becomes green with life and energy. There are wildflowers dotted throughout that rival your beauty, and animals rushing to prepare for winter, like your grand city's citizens runabout. A lake so clear you can see the bottom spreads out to the south. In the evening, when the sun settles into the mountains in front of our cabin, we'll sit on our porch as the Lord paints the sky a mirage of colors that reflect and sparkle off the lake. I've never seen a more beautiful sunset than the ones we get in our mountain paradise. Or maybe we'll spread a blanket over the soft grass, lie back and watch the colors of the sky fade and change to dark, then come to life with stars that glitter like those fancy dresses covered in jewels I saw in the store window today. I expect I'll enjoy experiencing that with you. You're quite the poet, Mr. Thomas. Victoria sighed. I can't wait to see the beautiful picture you just painted with your words. Joseph's ears warmed, and he said roughly, I'm nothing but a rough mountain man born and raised in the rugged wilderness, but please call me Joseph. You are no such thing, Victoria defended. You're kind and protective, intelligent and brave. You wear confidence and power like a tailored jacket, yet you aren't pompous or arrogant. I've never met a man like you before. Joseph stared at her across the narrow work table. Her eyes blazed with the conviction he'd witnessed earlier at the meeting. It humbled him, and he swallowed the lump that had formed in his throat. I pray I live up to that I'm a man you can depend on, Joseph confessed. I trust as long as we keep God the center of our life together, no matter our differences or struggles, we'll come out on the other side of life rejoicing, Victoria answered. Now, tell me about our cabin. Joseph laughed. It's nothing as grand as this house, I can assure you. I built it one summer when I found that meadow and lake in my wanderings. I knew that's where I wanted to put down roots. A rock face juts 300 yards up and ends in an overhang. The side of the mountain stretches like that along the lake and back the other way for a way. I figured when I built the cabin that if I built right up against the mountain, it'd protect me from one side and provide an additional roof from the overhang. It keeps the snow off the cabin for the most part. It sounds lovely. But Victoria's wavering voice betrayed her real fears about the remoteness. Joseph grimaced as he went on. I'm not going to lie to you, Victoria. The cabin is small. It's one room with a fireplace to cook in and heat the place, a bed and enough room left over for a table and chairs. However, we can add on as we see fit, and it's tight and warm. I'm not going to lie to you either, Joseph, Victoria replied as she licked the last of her icing off her fork, a look of worry crossing her face. I can't cook. I've never even made a pot of tea before. I'm afraid an open fireplace will be the death of any meal I attempt to make. Even a single-room cabin seems a bit daunting to keep house in, especially since I've always had servants to do everything for me. It's a blessing to never want for anything, but a curse as well, I suppose. Joseph dragged his eyes from her mouth and smiled. I have a feeling I'll teach you a lot of new skills. And I'll build you whatever you want and drag servants up the mountain to help you, if you'd rather. Victoria threw back her head and laughed. The sound traveled up through Joseph, bringing with it a light he'd never experienced before. It spread and warmed him with joy until he worried he might shame himself and cry. I suppose you'll teach me just as much though, he offered, rubbing a hand over his chest and clearing his throat. Victoria beamed. Joseph watched as she stood and strode around the work table, stopping inches from him with a gleam in her eyes. She boldly ran her hand down his arm and clenched his hand, causing Joseph's heartbeat to fly as fast as a hummingbird's wings. She leaned forward, her cake-sweetened breath tickling his senses, and kissed him on the cheek. "I'm much better and believe I'll turn in for what's left of the night," she declared as she stepped away from him. "Thank you, Joseph, for talking with me. I'm looking forward to the adventure God has for us." Joseph watched her leave and continued to stare at the space she'd vacated well past when she'd probably made it to her bed and slept. He huffed and rubbed his face, stabbing a large bite of cake. Life with Victoria was bound to be exciting, Joseph thought, as he smiled and shoved the cake into his mouth. He was quite up to the adventure, indeed. Chapter 8. Victoria always imagined her wedding day filled with rushing about, squeezed and tucked into the most fashionable gown sewn by the best shop, friends running willy-nilly like a bunch of hens in a co-op, and the church decorated with more flowers than an English garden. Her actual wedding day appeared to be shaping up much different from her childhood dreams. Victoria looked at her reflection in the dresser mirror and sighed. Her gown was her favorite from the last Christmas season. It was a deep purple silk that sat off her shoulders and tiered down the skirt in subtle ruffles. A contrasting emerald velvet belt wrapped across her stomach and down her hips, emphasizing her small waist. When she'd first worn it, her father had said she looked like a present all wrapped in its finest. Victoria hoped Joseph thought so too. She took one last look at her hair that the maid had tucked, twisted and curled upon her head, then surrounded it by little flowers and a jeweled pin that her father gave her of her mother's. A knock sounded at the door, followed by her father's inquiry. "Darling, are you ready?" Victoria walked to the door and opened it with a jaunty, "Well, what do you think, father?" She watched as her father's eyes filled with tears and he sniffed. "You're just as beautiful as your mother. How am I going to live without you here?" Her eyes stung and her stomach dropped to her toes. "We can find another way. I don't have to do this. I don't have to leave." No. That's just my selfishness coming through. I could never keep you safe. You'd end up sequestered to the house, unable to live. God made you for adventure, Victoria. I knew it from when you were a child, and also believe He made you for this, Joseph. I left to my room last night intent on spending the night in prayer, beseeching the Lord for wisdom for your future. I tell you, I got down on my knees, started thanking God for your protection, and by the time I got to asking about Joseph and your wedding to him, I had such peace, more peace than I've ever felt, that I went right to bed and slept the night through. If God's hand is in this marriage, who am I to worry about it?" Victoria dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief and smiled at her father. He'd always wanted her to have the best life imaginable. He allowed her to follow her unconventional dreams with only a slight raising of his eyebrows. She knew the fathers of her friends refused to allow their daughters much freedom. She thanked God her father saw her worth more than the vestige of power a beneficial marriage would afford. Victoria threw her arms around her father's neck and whispered, "I love you, father." "I love you too, sweetheart," he replied, pulling her in tight. "Now let's go get you married before you mess up your hair or gown." Victoria allowed her father to thread her hand into his arm and lead her down the stairs. She could hear a boisterous voice talking and the low, steady voice of her soon-to-be husband responding. A gasp from Mrs. Leader, the first to see them, followed their step into the parlor. Victoria watched as Joseph and a pastor she'd never met turned towards her. Joseph's eyes flared with appreciation and his throat bobbed in a gulp. She chuckled as the pastor elbowed Joseph in the side, which prompted him to cross the room in a dazed walk. "You look mesmerizing," Joseph breathed, unable to take his eyes off her. Victoria felt her cheeks warm as her father chuckled, kissed her on the cheek, and handed her over to Joseph. "If we plan on getting this adventure on the way, we better get you two married," her father said, as he clapped Joseph on the shoulder. Joseph turned to the pastor. "Victoria, I'd like to introduce Pastor Timothy Hudson of the First English Evangelical Lutheran Church. Pastor Hudson, I'd like to introduce my bride, Victoria Remming. The pleasure is all mine, I assure you. After Joseph's unusual arrival here, it intrigued me to see what God had in store for him. Imagine my surprise when I received a message requesting to perform his wedding to Miss Remming, no less, the man replied with a chuckle. Victoria looked at Joseph in question, and he shrugged. I'll tell you about it later. Shall we? Pastor Hudson asked. Before Victoria could blink, Mrs. Letter cried delicately into her handkerchief. Her father smiled from beside her, and the strange little pastor pronounced them husband and wife. She faced Joseph and wondered if this handsome man was truly hers. He placed his hand on her cheek and leaned down. While the kiss they shared was chaste and once again over much quicker than Victoria wanted, the tingles felt the night before zinged through her body again. Joseph placed his forehead to hers and whispered, Victoria Thomas, you are incredible. She chuckled as Mrs. Leader bustled up and squished her into a tight hug. The dear lady then rushed away, saying something about a wedding cake. Victoria looked at Joseph and stifled a laugh. What is the plan now? Victoria asked, taking Joseph's hand. He brought it up to his mouth and kissed it before answering, We have little time. We plan on dressing you as your maid, having you leave as if on an errand. I'll sneak out the back and meet you around the corner. I have already sent your trunk to a hotel in Allegheny City. From there, we'll leave on a steamboat heading west first thing tomorrow morning. No one should recognize you since you'll be wearing the simple clothes the housekeeper purchased earlier this morning. No one will expect you to leave, so no one should be looking. And that will be the end of Victoria Remming, Victoria lamented. Not the end, dear, Father said, pulling her into his arms. This is merely the next chapter. There is so much of your story still left to write. What adventures will you have? How many grandchildren will you give me? This is a whole new life for you to embrace and flourish in. If it's any consolation, I believe you will do splendid. Now go change. Adventure awaits. Victoria wiped the tears from her eyes and turned to her husband. Her father was right. She wasn't naive enough to believe hardships wouldn't come, but the adventure shining brightly in the future beckoned her. She walked into Joseph's opened arms. Epilogue. May 13, 1855. Joseph stared at the beautiful baby girl, bundled up against her mother's chest. He had difficulty accepting how blessed he was, swiping the tear that escaped down his cheek. He peered into the corner of the cabin where their 2-year-old son, Orlando, slept the night away, oblivious to the excitement that had taken place. The cabin had become crowded since he'd brought his wife home. She had a penchant for books, and had begged him to build shelves that now covered the walls with the histories, plays and novels she was so fond of. Looks like I need to add on to the cabin this summer, Joseph whispered as he stroked his finger down the feather-soft cheek of his daughter. There's no rush. I kind of enjoy how cozy it is when we're all together, Victoria murmured, snuggling closer to Joseph's side. Can you believe you've been here 3 years? It seems as if you've always been by my side. I still can't believe how easy it was to leave Pittsburgh unseen. No one even looked at us as we were boarding, even though I'd never felt so conspicuous without my hoops and proper bonnet. Do you miss those silly things? Joseph asked, twirling a strand of her long chestnut hair around his finger. She barked a laugh, startling the baby. Absolutely not. Victoria settled her, and sighed as she leaned back into Joseph's side. If it was up to him, this is where he'd stay forever, nestled within his family's love. What are we going to name her? He asked before he did something as ridiculous as blubbering like a baby. Well, I'm fond of Viola from Shakespeare. How about Viola Grace? She asked as she peered up at him. He kissed her on the lips, the touch still sending a rush to his toes. He looked back down at the baby's sweet face where it scrunched in dreams. "Viola Grace, I believe God's got some exciting plans for you," Joseph proclaimed. Joseph gently took Viola out of Victoria's arms as Victoria nodded off to sleep. He prayed Viola would find a husband that loved her as much as he loved her mother. He knew his children's life wouldn't be easy, but he promised God that he would show them to the path of light in this vast wilderness called home. Continue the Thomas family saga with Viola and Hunter's story in Vestige of Hope. About the author. Sara Blackard has been a writer since she was able to hold a pencil. When she's not crafting wild adventures and sweet romances, she's homeschooling her 5 children, keeping their off-grid house running, or enjoying the Alaskan lifestyle she and her husband love.